Is there something missing from your Azure DevOps pipeline that's deploying Terraform code? Is it Key Vault? Well, if it is, and you want to add Key Vault to your Azure DevOps pipeline using Terraform, then this will be the video for you. Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to Terraform Tuesdays. Today's topic, as I mentioned at the top, it's actually a continuation of a previous video, which should appear, any moment up here somewhere. And that previous video was setting up an Azure DevOps pipeline using Terraform. And as I said at the time, that was phase one of things. We were just getting comfortable, getting things set up. Now in phase two, we're going to add a little more complexity, but don't worry, it's nothing big. We're just adding Azure Key Vault into the mix, as well as creating some service principles using the Azure AD provider. So that's what we're going to get into. But before we do that, just two quick things. One, I want to remind you that I have a Terraform certification guide. If you're thinking about sitting for the Terraform certification for the associate level cert and you want a guide to help you out with that, I've got a guide for you. So check that out. The link is down in the description. Also, if you are interested in supporting this video and getting more content like this, hey, I have a Patreon. Why not join? It's only $2 a month and you get early access to videos and a weekly newsletter. So definitely check that out. All right, let's get into this. Azure DevOps using Azure Key Vault to store your variables. In the previous video, what we set up was an Azure DevOps pipeline. And of course, your Terraform configuration is going to need access to some variable values. So we configured a bunch of that using variable groups inside Azure DevOps pipelines. But that might not be the way you want to store your variables. Why not use something that's dedicated for secret material, stuff that you want to keep away from everybody else? Why not use Azure Key Vault to store your secrets? Now, I know what you're thinking here. Why not use HashiCorp Vault to store your secrets? And that is an opportunity and potentially another video. But in this case, we're going to stick with Microsoft-centric solutions. Since we're already using Azure DevOps, let's just use Key Vault. Plus, they already have a task for Key Vault, so it's pretty easy to implement. So what we're going to do is I will go over the changes in the configuration of what's being set up by the setup script, and then we'll walk through the actual deployment and show how it's accessing Key Vault, and we can even take a look at Key Vault if we want and see what's in there. So let's start by jumping over to the code and going over really quickly what has changed from the previous version of this pipeline. Okay, here we are in Visual Studio Code, and the directory we're working with today is 2021-05-25-ADO. This is a slightly modified version. So I've kept the original version from the previous video if you wanted to deploy that. I don't want to get the two mixed. So this is a newer version of the same deployment with the changes that I talked about. And there's a new README in here that goes over some of those changes, as well as the variables you'll be using to set things up. Now, once again, the setup script is using Terraform Cloud for its deployment to hold the remote state and also do the remote execution. So you're going to have to set up Terraform Cloud as a workspace and set some variables there if you haven't already done that from the previous example. And then that is going to go through the full setup process of creating your Azure DevOps pipeline and creating the Key Vault and the storage account. So that's a high-level view of what we're doing. Why don't we get into what's in some of the files here, and we can start with expanding setup. There we go. And we can just start with Azure AD because it's all the way at the top. So within Azure AD, we're going to need two service principles here. And this time around, I'm creating the service principles dynamically as opposed to statically putting them in as variables that are being passed through Terraform. So in this case, we need two service principles. What are the two things we need service principles for? The first thing that we need a service principle for is to access Key Vault. We're going to create a Key Vault, and then we're going to grant this service principal permissions to connect to that Key Vault. And then within Azure DevOps, we'll create what's called a service endpoint that maps that service principal to the Key Vault and really the subscription, the Azure subscription that has that Key Vault in it. So that's one service principle. The second service principal that we're going to create is going to be the service principal that's actually used in the pipeline to create resources in an Azure subscription. Now, if you think about it, this makes sense. You might actually have one subscription that has your Key Vault in it, and a totally separate subscription where you want to create resources, and you might not want to use the same service principal to access both. So I'm giving you the option of creating those service principals independently, and you could expand this out to multiple environments, right? So that's what we're going to create within the script. All right, so this first one that we're creating, and the order of operations here is you have to create an Azure AD application, and then you can create a service principal based off of that application. And then finally, you can create a password for it and then set up that password as a value. So we have 4 resources here that are basically centered around creating the application, the service principal, a password, and then finally assigning that password value to the service principal. In a newer version of the Azure AD provider, when they get to 2.0, it's on 1.5 right now, it will auto-generate secrets for you, or passwords. They're calling them secrets now. It will auto-generate that for you, so you're not going to need that random password step, and it actually gives us a warning it's been deprecated. But for 1.5 and until they get to 2.0, you still need to create a password and assign it. So that's what we're doing here. And then if we scroll down a little bit more, we have our second application and service principal that's being used for resource creation. So this is the one that's used in the pipeline to actually create the resources within Azure. So we have our application, our service principal, our password, and assigning that password to the service principal. Awesome. That's all set up. And then the last thing we're going to do is, because we are creating resources in a subscription in our pipeline, we have to grant this service principal access to that subscription. So I'm simply giving it contributor level access in the subscription that I'm currently working within. Now, obviously, you might want to change this in a production scenario and put a variable in here for the subscription where you actually want to grant it access. And maybe you only want to grant it access to the resource group and not the entire subscription. Obviously, that's up to you. This is just an example of how you might go about it. So that's everything that's in Azure AD. Now let's flip over to Key Vault and see what we're doing in that file. All right. So here is Azure Key Vault. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm getting some information about the current credentials that I'm using to access Azure and Azure AD, as well as some information about the subscription that I'm currently using. So I'm going to grab those as data sources, and then I'm going to create my Key Vault. So within this, I'm using the standard SKU because I'm not going to use an HSM. I'm not going to use a dedicated HSM, I should say, which is what comes with the premium SKU. Don't need that, don't need to spend the money. So we'll keep it at a standard level. And then I'm going to create 2 access policies. One grants the service principal that's currently doing all this work full access to the Key Vault. So that's what we're doing with the tenant ID and the object ID. We're looking up information about the current client that's being used to create this Key Vault, and we're granting it full key permissions, full secret permissions, and full certificate permissions. Now, we're actually only creating secrets, so I could have stopped at just secret permissions, but I decided in this case, just leave it wide open, right? And then in the second access policy, we're going to configure the service principal that we just created in the Azure AD.tf file. We're going to grant that very specific access. We're going to grant it get and list, and that's it. And for the object ID, for this particular instance, you're going to need to get the object ID of the service principal, not the application. And it can be a little confusing where you need the application ID and the service principal object ID. So I'm going to call it out here. You need the object ID from the service principal for this access policy. All right, scrolling down a little bit more, we're now going to add all of our secrets that we want to use in the pipeline to Key Vault. And I'm going to use a for each loop to do that. Now, you'll notice there's the depends on here that I've added for the access policy that grants the current client, you, full access to Key Vault. And the reason is because I ran into this condition where when I tried to destroy the Key Vault, it destroyed the access policy before it destroyed the secrets, which meant that the client I was currently using no longer had access to delete the secrets, and it became like a race condition thing. So I put in the depends on so it makes sure that it creates the access policy that you need to use first, and it also waits to delete that policy until the secrets are gone. Aha, thinking. All right. So that's one of those cases where depends on is actually required. For each is going to loop through a map that I have in my local variables. So if we open up our variables file and scroll all the way down to here, under locals, I have a pipeline variables local value that is a map of all the variables that I want to use in my pipeline, and they're going to be created as secrets, with the key being the secret name and then the value being the secret value. So if we go back to the key vault, you can see I'm just looping through. Name is equal to each.key, value is equal to each.value, and I'm creating them in the key vault that I've just created. So that's the key vault. That's everything that's happening in there. It's going to create the key vault and grant permissions and create all those secrets. So that's what's being done there. Now we have to go into Azure DevOps and see what needs to be created there to access this key vault. All right, so in Azure DevOps, most of this stays the same from the previous project, but now we're going to scroll down and there is a slight change in our variable group. Now we don't need such a long list of variables. Now we only need 2 variables. We need to give a service name. This is the service endpoint that we'll create in a second. And we need to give a key vault name. What key vault is it going to access within the context of the pipeline? And that's it. Those are all the variables that we have to set for the variable group within the pipeline project. Scrolling down a bit more, we get into the key vault setup, and there's 2 resources we have to create here. The first one is the service endpoint _ Azure RM. This basically creates a connection to an Azure RM subscription from the pipeline project, and you have to specify a client you want to use to make that connection. So we specify the project that we want to associate the service endpoint with. We have to give the service endpoint a name, and that's the name we'll use to refer to it in our variables and possibly our project pipeline. And under credentials, we'll give it the service principal ID and the service principal key for the service principal that we created earlier specifically for this purpose. And in this case, the service principal ID, you would think, oh, that's the object ID of the service principal. But no, nay. It is the application ID of the application you created for the service principal, which I agree. I know you're like, that makes no sense. That's just what it is. And after some trial and error, I discovered that. So maybe I'm saving you some time by discovering that as well. And then it needs the tenant ID, the subscription ID that this is going to connect to, and the name of the subscription, which you can get from the data source Azure RM subscription current display name. So that's how we're getting all of that information. And then the last thing is we have to authorize our project to use this service endpoint we just created. So we're going to create an Azure DevOps resource authorization between the project and the service endpoint. Once that is done, boom, now this subscription is connected and we can access that key vault, assuming we're using a service principal that has access to that key vault, which is the service principal that we just used here. Okay, so that's everything that has basically changed when it comes to the Terraform configuration. Now, you might be wondering what's different about the pipeline. In the previous version of the Azure pipelines, we loaded in a variable group that had all of our values in it, and we simply use that. Now, in this case, we're going to be using an Azure Key Vault. And the way that Key Vault does it is you specify which Key Vault you want to load, and then you have to tell it if you want to load all of the secrets in the Key Vault, or if you only want to load a subset of secrets based off of some sort of prefix or regular expression, basically. So once you have loaded those secrets, the name of each secret is going to be the variable by which you refer to it in the pipeline. And if there's going to be any kind of collision between variable names, then you can be more specific about the variable with a longer path. But as long as there's no collisions, you can just use the variable name and it will be available within the pipeline. Now, I tend to use all of these as environment variables because that's what makes the most sense to me. But we'll see how I have it configured in the pipeline in a moment. All right, back in Visual Studio Code, let's expand out the VNet folder that actually has my Azure pipelines in here and take a look at that pipeline. All right, so the main thing that has changed here is if we scroll down, within the first stage, which is the validate stage, this is where it validates that the Terraform configuration is in fact correct. There's now an additional task in here. The first one is to install Terraform, so it's still going to do that. Then the next one is to load the Key Vault secrets. And as I said a moment ago, there's a few settings you need to give. You need to give it the service endpoint name. They call it the connected service name. That's the service endpoint name. And then for the Key Vault name, you just have to give it the name of the key vault that it will find in that service connection to grab the secrets from. And then you can specify a secrets filter if you don't want all of the secrets that are in Key Vault. Now, scrolling down a little bit more, how do we make use of these values that we find in Key Vault? Well, we're going to use at least one of those values in the init process, and that value is the SAS token. As you can see, we're setting it as an environment variable, and under the environment variable, we're simply saying use the variable SAS token. Where is it getting that value from? Why don't we go over to the Azure Key Vault and see what secrets are actually in there? All right, over in the Azure Key Vault that we created, this is a list of all the secrets that are available in our Key Vault, and you can see that one of the secrets is called SAS token. So it uses that name as the variable name that you'll use in your pipeline. And that's pretty much it. It's going to load the values from all of these different secrets into the pipeline, and then you can use them by their variable names. So let's go back to the pipeline. Okay, back in the pipeline, we're going to go through our validate process, and then we're going to go through our plan process. That was the next stage here. And because it's a new stage and it's a new job with new steps, we have to specify the Azure Key Vault task again to load those secrets for this step. So because of that, we're going to load the Azure Key Vault values again, and then we're going to initialize Terraform just like we did, and then we're going to run a Terraform plan. And here we're making use of a bunch of the other values that we got out of Key Vault, things like the AZ client ID, client secret, subscription, and tenant. Those correspond to the values from the service principal that we created to explicitly create resources in the target Azure subscription. So we created both service principals. Remember, one is for Key Vault access and the other one is to create resources. This is the latter of those two. And then everything else stays the same. We go through an approve stage, and then finally an apply stage where we create those same resources. And once again, we need the Azure Key Vault task in here to load those same variables. All right, so that's everything that is different in the pipeline from the way that it was before. Let's go ahead and take a look first at what's going on in Terraform Cloud, and then we'll kick off a run of this pipeline. All right, here's the workspace that I'm using in Terraform Cloud for my remote run. And if we scroll down, we can see under Terraform variables, I've got two values in here, and these are documented in the README, so you don't have to jot these down now. And then I have 5 environment variables, and you'll note this is a lot less than was in the previous version, and that's because we're dynamically creating that service principal. I don't need to specify that information in here. It's all being done and created in Key Vault as opposed to passing it to the Azure pipelines as a variable group. So less work is going on here. And if we go over to runs, we can see the most recent run was applied about 20 hours ago. That's when I finally got everything working on this side. So this is what you should see here. It should create everything pretty easily. I destroyed the previous version of everything and then recreated it from scratch just to make sure it would work. And sure enough, it did. Okay, so that's everything that's happening in Terraform Cloud. Let's go over to our projects in Azure DevOps. And there is our pipeline project. So let's go ahead and click on that. And first, let's go to project settings. And under there, you can see the service connections, which are also sometimes called service endpoints. There's a lot of crossover when it comes to verbiage here, which can get a little frustrating. But anyway, so in here, you can see we've got the Key Vault connection. That's the one it's using to connect to the Azure subscription that has our Key Vault. Awesome. That's good to know. All right, let's go back to the pipelines here, and we're going to go down to library. And here's where our variable groups are. And if we go look at our variable groups, All right, cool. We have two variables, key vault name and the service name. Remember, the service is that service connection we just saw, and the key vault is obviously the key vault that's in that service connection. Cool. Now let's go over to pipelines, and let's go ahead and go into this pipeline. And if we want to, we can either kick off a run here, or we can make a commit to this repository, and that will automatically trigger a build. Well, that sounds a little more interesting, so why don't we do that? All right, back in Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and make a change to the main.tf file. So if I scroll down in the previous video, I added a subnet. Let's add that subnet again. So we'll give it this IP address range, and we'll give it a name. We'll call it subnet 3 because I am feeling very creative. All right, go ahead and save that file. That's an official change, and hasn't detected it yet. There we go. All right. So we'll call this subnet 3 again, and I'll go ahead and commit that change and push it. And now in a few moments, we should see a fresh pipeline kick off. All right, so I'll go back to here, and if I back out 1 minute, we can see a new pipeline run has kicked off, and it's currently in this stage of validate. So we'll go ahead and let this run, and then I'm going to show you the key vault task just so you can see that it does in fact work within the pipeline. All right, so the validate stage has completed, and we can take a look at the Azure Key Vault task. And within the Azure Key Vault task, once the visual loads, we can see, all right, there it goes, downloading the secrets from the Key Vault. It found 8 secrets in total because we specified we wanted all secrets, and it downloaded all of the secrets with their values. So now those secrets are available for any additional tasks within this stage. Now we're in plan. Plan is going to go ahead and initialize Terraform and go through the plan process. Now there should be some changes because we are adding an additional subnet. So it should tell us about those changes, and then we can approve those changes once that's complete. So it looks like the plan completed successfully. Let's go ahead and click on that. And sure enough, it's going to create one new subnet. That's exactly what we would expect. Now it's waiting for approval. I'll go ahead and approve the change. There we go. Resume. And now it's going to go into the apply phase and complete the change that it suggested in the plan. And that's going to do it for phase 2 of my Azure DevOps pipeline implementation. In this one, we added Key Vault and we dynamically created some service principals as well as the service connection endpoint within Azure DevOps. So all of that is accomplished now. Now, obviously, there's still more I want to do here. For instance, rather than going through the logs to look at the plan, it would be great if I could output the plan to a file and stash that file somewhere, and then use that file for the actual apply and also send that log output somewhere else. That makes a lot of sense. So I think for phase 3, I'm going to focus on getting that plan file in place. And also I'd like to break this pipeline in 2, where there's one pipeline that runs when a pull request is sent to the main branch. So that indicates that someone has updated the code and they want to merge it into main. The pull request will trigger the first pipeline, which validates the code that it meets all the necessary specs. And that's where you might do, in addition to validation, you might check the formatting to make sure they formatted their code properly. And you might also do some other checking from like Chekhov or something from Bridge Crew to make sure it meets whatever regulations or best practices you have in place. So that would be the first pipeline. And then the second pipeline would be when the merge actually happens, the pull request is approved. Okay, now it's actually going to make the changes, or at least do the plan. Or I'm not exactly sure how I want to do this. So that's something that I need to still work out. But that's the 2 things I want to do in phase 3. So that should be coming up probably next week. I'm kind of enjoying this vibe. So I'm probably going to do that one next week. But that's going to do it for this week. Thank you, as always, so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you don't mind subscribing to the channel, I also appreciate that too. That's awesome. Thank you so much. If you want to share this with a friend or a colleague, I love that. That's awesome. And if you want to support me on Patreon, that's also awesome. $2 a month is, if you can't afford it, I totally understand. Just enjoy the videos. But if you can't afford $2 a month, it's not bad. You get early access to videos and a newsletter every week. Not bad at all. That'll do it for me for today. As always, stay healthy, stay safe out there. Bye for now. That rainbow is it's real bright. I know it's very bright. I just swapped out the batteries on it, and dang, there's no dimmer switch on that. A few people have actually asked me where I got that. Five Below. If you have Five Below near you, it was over in like the dormitory decoration section. So I guess go there and see if they still have it. It was $5, so not bad for a little office decor. Bye.